McClain here. Some of you are reading all the poems in his book. Some of us are just reading a couple of the poems. And Professor McClain is he's a professor at Hampshire College, and he's a poet, as you know. He's the editor of the Massachusetts Review, a poetry journal. And we want to welcome him here to Queensborough on behalf of myself, Beth Cunahan, Ilse Schreinemakers, Sybil White. The three of us, we're the ones who put together the whole welcome read. And it's really Ilse who wrote the big fat National Endowment for the Humanities grant that's able to fund everything. You know, you got your cookies coming at the end. Grab and go. So now we just want to let Nathan do his thing, and thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you all very much for being here. Thank you for having me. It's a wonderful opportunity. I'm going to be doing a bit of a little craft talk. That's one of the things that my advisors, one of my strongest advisors in grad school used to talk about a lot was the value of, for at least the writer or for the poet, that their greatest strength is in paying attention, and that is the thing that is one of the the most beneficial things that a writer can do. So I have this a talk that's mostly thinking a lot about paying attention, and that's thinking about sustained attention at that. So I'm just going to talk about that. We're going to look at a few different pieces of writing from a number of different genres, some of those being poetry, some of those being memoir, doing a little bit of fiction, and then circling back to poetry. And then we'll let you all go to have your cookies. My extreme and most humble thanks once again to Ilse, to Beth, and to Sybil for just arranging this program. It's really marvelous to be here with all of you, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to get to share just some insights and some things that I have learned over my years of writing and the things that I'm still learning in my time of writing. So this is largely just a craft talk that wants to think about duration or sustained attention. Around the same time that my daughter Zora, who just turned 2, but around the time that she turned a year old, my wife and I adopted a puppy, and that would have been like maybe 6 months old at the time. A small pit bull mix. We were not told it was a pit bull mix. We were told it was a Chihuahua. And when we went to pick it up, we were quite surprised. It was, if I might say so, a genius idea to our minds. The puppy and the baby would keep each other company. They'd entertain one another while my wife and I finished moving into, unpacking, and arranging our new house. So yes, there was also a new house, and the moving, and what my wife likes to lovingly refer to as projects. The kind of attention that a house requires is not the same kind of attention a puppy or a toddler or a spouse requires, but there are certain similarities. Trying to prevent the dog from, crouching over some other new spot of carpet, or trying to keep our daughter from caterpillaring her way to the next set of stairs requires a different kind of attention than, say, determining where the extra rolls of toilet paper are stored, which my wife asserts is critical. It requires the kind of attention my daughter displayed when she played with a single magnet, a little French fry magnet, for the better part of an hour, sitting in front of the dishwasher, just affixing it to the front of the machine, then taking it off, and then sticking it to the underside of the machine, and taking it off. For an entire hour, she did this, and it was pretty remarkable. I would like to believe, and for many of you who have read my work, and I'm so grateful for the fact that you've read many of these poems, that present within my own poetry and in my own creative work and certainly most present in the work of poets and writers who I most admire. Some of these includes my very personal touchstones, which range from poets like Elizabeth Bishop or Robert Hayden, from Nicole Seeley or the poet John Murillo or Ross Gay, some of whom you might be familiar with, others you might not. But I would hope that in my work there is this fierce and unflinching attentiveness, which is really what I look for, and what captures me in poetry, like that of a small child captured by the most unlikely toy. Once again, the greatest strength of the poet, as an advisor told me, is in paying attention, and I've found this to be true more than once. Several years ago, at the 20th annual Cave Canem retreat, I learned from poet, writer, and genius, the poet Chris Abani, that, and this seems very simple, but he told me in an interview that a camera, no matter how good the camera, is purely mechanical. By which he means that a camera doesn't see what you see. A camera only sees what's in front of it. And that the thing that we as poets and writers have to do, and what we are tasked with doing, is not only learning how to see, but learning how to also frame what you see so that the camera also sees. And that's really like so much of what we're hoping to do. In the poem "Boy Pulling a Thorn from His Foot," which maybe some of you have read while you were studying this book, the poem that opens my most recent collection, previously owned, the speaker poses the question, "And what have you learned from standing here so long examining pain?" Elsewhere in the collection, the speaker states, "Sometimes I look. Sometimes I get swept up in all the looking." But why all the looking is ultimately the question that one might ask. And why look with such intensity, and why look for so long? How might it serve to reveal character? How might it serve to reveal emotional or psychological state of being or preoccupation? How might our attention create an accurate or an appropriate frame for the reader to experience in your own writing, which hopefully there are those of you in this space who are also partaking upon the gift of writing. The poet Carl Phillips, whose poem is here, and which I'll read for you in just a moment, but the poet Carl Phillips has at some point written that, quote, "It's a human need to make of shapelessness a form." And he's also said that we give shape to shapelessness and we call it meaning. Phillips's rather beautiful way of describing this very impulse of like making poems or making anything artistic, is perhaps, and perhaps any form of art, certainly resonates with my own practice as a way of wrestling with ambiguity, as like a way of trying to really understand it or to contain it. Poetry really as a form of control. And if this argument is indeed true, then one of the manners by which Phillips frequently attempts to control is at the level of the sentence, which we'll look at in this poem here very shortly. In his poem, As From a Quiver of Arrows, which was published by the Atlantic magazine in 1985, it's composed of 8 5-line stanzas, which we'll see, and is uniquely constructed of almost all questions or almost all interrogatives, save for the one odd declarative toward the poem's center, which in a poem that is built on questions calls attention to itself as different, and it also signals a certain shift in the poem as well, which I hope you'll see as I give this a read. So this is As From a Quiver of Arrows. What do we do with the body? Do we burn it? Do we set it in dirt or in stone? Do we wrap it in balm, honey, oil, and then gauze, and tip it and onto and trust it to a raft and to water? What will happen to the memory of his body if one of us doesn't hurry now and write it down fast? Will it be like salt or late light that it melts like? Floss, rubber gloves, and a chewed cap to a pen elsewhere. How are we to regard his effects? Do we throw them or use them away? Do we say they are relics and so treat them like relics? Does his soiled linen count? If so, would we be wrong then to wash it? There are no instructions whether it should go to where are those with no linen, or whether by night we should memorially wear it ourselves, by day reflect upon it folded, shelved, empty. Here, on the floor behind his bed, is a bent photo. Why? Were the two of them lovers? Does it mean where we found it that he forgot it, or lost it, or intended a safekeeping? Should we attempt to make contact? What if this other man too is dead, or alive but doesn't want to remember, is human? Is it okay to be human and fall away from oblation and memory if we forget and can't sometimes help it, and sometimes it is all that we want? How long, in dawns or new cocks, does that take? What if it is rest and nothing else that we want? Is it a findable thing? Small? In what hole is it hidden? Is it maybe a country? Will a guide be required who will say to us how? Do we fly? Do we swim? What will I do now with my hands? So that poem, as you may have noticed, is built almost entirely of the interrogative gesture or of questions, which infuses it with a kind of obsessiveness at its outset. You have the speaker who is constantly trying to probe this thing. Almost the way a young child repeatedly poses the question, but why? Whenever you tell them, like, you answer the thing that they just asked, and they continue to just pepper you with whys. The interrogative mood, or this mood of asking questions as a craft tool, possesses a wonder and uncertainty. There's an intellectual and emotional grappling that complicates the poem's tonal register as the speaker negotiates the circumstances before him. In this particular case, there's a deceased figure, his personal effects, and a discovered photo. But also with the ambiguity and the abstraction of death itself. These questions, like the quiver invoked by the poem's title, are fired in rapid succession. They just come one after the other after the other. And the poem's thinking is pretty associative. Like, it moves from the deceased body to the memory of the body to the melting away of memory, and so forth. If thinking is what human beings do with experience, and I believe that that's true, then the poem enacts a mind in action, a thinking and a feeling mind. And as though emptying the quiver of arrows towards its target, these questions that are launched again and again in an attempt to come ever closer to a bullseye. So it's just, we're trying to get the thing right. We're trying to better understand the thing. The poet's mode of questioning here accomplishes several things at once. Among them, directing the reader's gaze and attention. It helps us to know what we're looking at or what we should be paying attention to. On a practical or biological level, our minds are constantly trying to anticipate what will happen next. Whenever we read something, you don't even notice that you're doing it. Your mind's always trying to predict what's going to happen next. And so our subconscious, whenever we encounter a question, immediately starts searching for an answer, within or without a given text. Or in other words, that the poem offers question after question with no resolution, enacts the speaker's as well as our own bewilderment and with the unresolved fact of death. So let's consider, just for instance, the poem's opening stanza, which I'll go back up to just so you can see it. Just its opening stanza, which is itself like a single question. The longer the speaker tarries with this unknown body, in this case for 5 lines, the greater the sense of sacredness or reverence with which is to be done with it develops. And so, one may expect certain aspects of this particular poem. One expects after a death, the burning, the dirt, the stone. We expect that to follow a death. But with each subsequent clause that shows up, we encounter that which is unexpected, which is almost seemingly from another dispensation of time altogether, particularly with like the balm, the honey, the gauze, the raft, the river. That seems to come from like someplace else entirely. The details are very ceremonious. And so when I think about this notion of duration and the longer that we are tending to a particular subject, duration here complicates that which is under close scrutiny, and it imparts greater nuance, greater import for that which is within one's gaze, and reveals aspects of personality and character in the way figuration can, or in the way that like simile and metaphor can. Later stanzas reveal salt, late light, relics which reinforce or enlarge earlier nods to reverence, almost like the burial rites of a saint, or at least in the mind of this speaker. Though, isn't this how, I would imagine like how the loss of any or all human life should be regarded? Like I'm thinking, of course, now of like we're inundated with all the news that's coming out of Israel and Palestine. I mean, there's so much loss of human life that we have to think about. Shouldn't we all human life be treated with such reverence as what's happening in this poem? And furthermore, wouldn't one's own mortality naturally be brought into question? And I think about that a lot with regards to this poem. In the latter half of Phillips's poem, which we'll scroll to, Phillips's deployment of the interrogative gesture, or this mode of asking questions, the speaker encounters this bent photo, and it offers opportunities for conjecture. The speaker starts to question, what's the nature of the relationship? Were the two of them lovers? So conjecture as well as projection. What if this other man too is dead or alive, but doesn't want to remember, is human? Is it okay to be human? Which grants the reader access to the speaker's concerns, his feeling mind, which we could easily spend the entirety of our time disassembling. What narratives might be constructed from the innocuous artifacts that populate our lives, the very small details. And do these stories make room for passion? Do they make room for love, or only more loss? What does it mean to be, which is what it means to be human, being open and available to all of these things, including loss. And of course, that ever pressing question of, is it okay to be human? Now, of course, questions of love, human loss, and grief are not poetry's territory to explore alone. And I'll take us next to a small section of a wonderful text. This is from a text, Tastes Like War, by the author Grace Cho. This is a memoir that she wrote that was published a couple of years ago and was a National Book Award finalist in memoir, I want to say back in 2021. But among other things, this is a book that explores a daughter's search through the intimate and global history and roots of her mother's schizophrenia. So this is a character who's like realizing these things about her mom. A couple of years ago, it was Hampshire College's common read, which was wonderful. We actually had a chance to have Grace Cho come out and give a talk for our students, which was quite wonderful. And she was able to also read from the book. But if you're unfamiliar with it, it is a beautiful and painful investigation. Many of my students deeply resonated with the memoir's exploration of young adulthood, particularly young adulthood with a parent that is ill, or that a parent that is experiencing illness. And the memoir, and they also identified with the many wonderful and lovely food memories that are explored in the book as well. Cho's memoir is carefully written. It's featuring a number of wonderful instances of image, which I refer to largely because while image is very characteristic in poetry, it isn't required in prose. So when images come up in prose, it's always worth looking at. So we're just going to continue this one little short sort of like section of it. here. And I want to back up just for a moment and define what I mean by image. Because sometimes when it comes to image in poetry, some may think that anything that's visual that shows up in a poem is an image, but to my mind, image is very different from detail, but you couldn't have the former without the latter. So simply put, detail to my mind is something that just conveys information to the reader. Image, on the other hand, or conversely, requires some additional information outside of or some modification of the detail to transform it into an image, which you'll understand a bit more as we read through this text. So therefore, image, it gains more import, it gains more nuance as we are considering work. Usually image is often achieved through simile, through just figurative language, like simile, metaphor, adjectives as they modify. Sometimes juxtaposition can do that. Though additionally, and particularly in the case of Cho's memoir, I would argue that duration, which we've been talking about, or this sort of like careful paying attention, this sustained attention, is capable of transforming a detail into an image as well. And so we'll look at this section of Tastes Like War. This is the start of chapter 5, called Kimchi Blues, and it starts with these two quotes. One from The Economist: unscientific studies conclude that if you were to ask 10 Koreans what is the one thing you cannot live without, at least 7 of them would say kimchi. And then from Cho's mother's own war story: when my family was gone, I ate kimchi. I might not have survived without it. This is in New York City, 2008. A week after my mother died, I stopped at a grocery store in Manhattan's Koreatown and bought a jar of kimchi. I didn't give it much thought at first. It was an instinct. Stopping at the market on my way to Penn Station, where I'd catch the Northeast Corridor line to her house, had become a weekly habit during the 10 years that she lived in New Jersey. When I left the store that day, I meant to get on the downtown Q train that would take me home, but instead I walked right past it and almost arrived at Penn Station before I remembered that my mother had died. I stopped in the middle of the walk on 32nd Street, blocking the flow of traffic as throngs of tourists and commuters pushed past me. I peered into my shopping bag at the jar of kimchi and watched dark spots spread across the brown paper bag where my tears hit the bag. Why did I buy this? She's not even here to eat this with me. I don't even like kimchi that much. The kimchi sat in my fridge for weeks, swimming in a sea of garlic, chili, its odors slowly permeating all my other food as it fermented. Everything I ate vaguely tasted of it, reminding me that my mother was gone. The first time I opened the tall glass jar, the smell hit me so hard that waves of grief rose up through my chest and in my throat until my body gave into its weight and I was sobbing over the kitchen sink. Every couple of days, I forced myself to eat some kimchi with my rice or ramen, tasting its transformation from the garlicky crunch to fresh cabbage to the pungent tang of soft, ripe kimchi, the whole life cycle on my palate. By the time I ate my way through the jar, something shifted in my consciousness, and I went back to Han Rem to buy some more. I contemplated the orderly rows of kimchi in all their varieties: garlic, chive, oyster, radish, cucumber, scallion, and the classic Napa cabbage, before selecting a quart of the classic mat kimchi. Remember, I said to myself, this time I knew full well she was dead. And the memoir is just really quite beautiful. And so one of the things that we notice that the longer that Cho's speaker turns this detail of kimchi in her mind, the more challenging and multifaceted the detail becomes. Its smell and taste, she says, permeates all of her other food. So it acts as a reminder of her mother's death whenever Cho consumes anything. Which is the way that, obviously that grief can consume us. And again, completely takes over her refrigerator. This is exactly how grief works. And remember, this is before that she even opens the jar. When she writes, the first time I opened the jar, the smell hit me so hard that waves of grief rose in my chest and in my throat until my body gave into its weight and I was sobbing over the sink. Now, I cannot say that I myself have ever eaten kimchi and been overwhelmed by waves of grief, but I imagine that this sensation has accompanied some food memory that I've had, to be sure. The speaker's emotional and psychological state here, what she's been through, transforms the jar into something far weightier and far more complex. And Cho enacts this effect by her refusal to turn her attention away from this specific detail. Like she stays with it, she refuses to look away. Furthermore, Cho, by continuing to focus on the detail, allows the jar of kimchi to transform yet again into an image that returns her mother to her in some way, and one that is, not one that's just solely reminiscent of her mother being taken away. She returns to the market, contemplates, all the rows of kimchi, all the different flavors. But we can see that by the time we reach the end of this section, that the speaker is able to re-see them almost the way that her mother before her saw them. And to re-see them, to receive the kimchi as a way of, as the chapter starts, as a way of like surviving trauma or tragedy or displacement, of enduring anything, and of conjuring or holding some piece of home. So furthermore, as we move on, I've got just a couple more pieces for you to consider. We'll look at another writer who has survival or at least impending death on his mind is the poet and writer Matthew Olman. If you're unfamiliar with Olman's work, I would highly encourage you to check out his poems and his stories. He is immensely funny, as I think you'll see in this text as well. For our purposes, we're going to consider his very short fiction piece, Lightning, and I'll just read through this a bit and allow you to see. You'll begin to pick up on a pattern fairly quickly with what he's doing here. Lightning. In the name of God, please let me die in peace. Those are the last words of Voltaire. Then he looked at the priest standing above his bed and died. Crito, I owe a cock to Acephalus. Will you remember to pay the debt? Those are the last words of Socrates. Then he drank some hemlock and died. In the final stages of cerebral meningitis, Oscar Wilde looked around the room and said, either this wallpaper goes or I do. Then he coughed up some blood and died. I'm waiting for my doctor to return and thinking about last words because there's a possibility that I should be preparing to make my own such statement very soon. The examination room is like any other. White walls, a chart with a diagram of the heart, a framed poster with a picture of a matador slaying a bull and a caption that reads, ambition. An examination table with white paper that makes crinkling sounds when I move even a little. Picasso's last words were, drink to me. Frank Sinatra said, I'm losing. Humphrey Bogart said, hurry back. I wish the doctor would hurry back. Here's how Lyme disease works. It gets inside you and messes with your heart and nervous system. Named after a town in Connecticut, it's spread by ticks. They bite you, they hang on, and that's how it begins. First, there's a tiny rash around the bite, then bacteria spreads to the bloodstream. I have 3 tick bites on my left ankle. In a couple minutes, the doctor will return to tell me how long I have left to live. The door opens, the doctor returns. You don't have Lyme disease, she says. But what about the tick bites? Being bitten by a tick doesn't automatically mean you Lyme disease. She shakes her head, hands me some forms to sign. Besides, those aren't even from ticks. They're from mosquitoes. The mosquito is the most dangerous animal in the world. The last thing Harry Houdini said was, I'm tired of fighting. I guess this thing is going to get me. In the evening, I sit down at my desk to do some research. Blue light from the computer screen fills the room. Take the total number of people killed annually by tigers, stray dogs, and rattlesnakes. Add in the number of mauled by bears or trampled by elephants, death by bull shark, death by lion, adding it up and multiply by 1,000. The mosquito kills more. Consider malaria. Spread exclusively by the mosquito, over 200 million people are affected each year. Each year, close to 1 million of these cases are fatal. The last thing Eugene O'Neill said was, I knew it. Born in a hotel room, and goddamn it, died in a hotel room. Frédéric Chopin's final request was, swear to make them cut me open so I won't be buried alive. Chopin likely died of cystic fibrosis. O'Neill from a neurological condition that's known to mostly affect horses and dogs. Those are both ailments I've thought of before. What I've never imagined, and I'm angry with myself for this oversight, was the salivary glands of the mosquito, how something sinister sleeps there, and how what sleeps there enters the body uninvited. It sets up camp and multiplies and multiplies. A chill, a wave of fever, your kidneys are failing, you're gone. Did you know that there are over 20 kinds of mosquitoes in southeastern Michigan? I asked my wife. And did you know all of them are lethal? What? It's right there on the website. First, darling, she said, that's bullshit. And second, my dear, you don't have malaria. She twirls over to my desk, picks up my empty coffee mug, and whisks it away. And you don't have leukemia or a brain embolism, she said, retreating into the kitchen. And you know those wires above the fuse box? Yes, I asked. The electrician was here this morning, and they're fine. We're not going to die in some weird explosion. The brakes on your car are fine, and there are no meteor showers scheduled for this evening. She laughs and walks back into the room. Don't laugh, meteor showers happen. Yes, but not here, she says, kissing me on the forehead. And when they do, most people think they're glorious. Now turn off the computer, it's time for bed. I go to bed. The dark swallows me like a mouthful of water. Inside the dark, I wonder how many men throughout history have died in their sleep. Probably a bazillion. How many of them saw it coming? The last thing Lord Byron said was, good night. O. Henry said, turn up the lights. I don't want to go home in the dark. And Thomas Edison simply whispered, it's so beautiful out there. I wonder what Edison meant by that. What was beauty to him? He who invented the electric chair and once electrocuted a horse. What a terrible way for a horse to die. The animal could have never understood how or why fate tightens its buckles and fastens its clamps, how or why a hand throws a switch. I close my eyes and dream of that horse, a stallion running at full gallop through a lightning storm. There's a beach, the waves are splenetic and sprawl backward forever. Perhaps lightning is thrown from the clouds and delivered by the gods of an older era. The gods are muscled and pale with rage, relics of a time when earth was new, mercurial, rippled with magic. Then the actions of gods could be explained, and their subjects could pray or make sacrifices of flesh to assuage their anger. Not anymore. The horse runs because running is what it knows. Its body glistens and its black muscles shine like heaven. But eventually, it wears down, gives in. The lightning is capricious and cannot be sated and is everywhere. So this story opens with 3 instances of the narrator recounting last words, Voltaire, Socrates, and Oscar Wilde, which reveal so much about the psychological state of being of the speaker right at the outset. This is a narrator who is clearly obsessive, a bit paranoid and morbid, though learned, and at least an avid reader, or at least an avid Googler, as we can tell. His attention particularly held by the last words of famous figures. In Olman's story, the use of a repetition of diction, this sort of repeated phrasing that he uses, another effective poetic device for directing attention as well as duration, which we've been talking about. There are at least 12 instances in the story in which the narrator shares the words of a recognizable figure from history or pop culture. it not only reinforces the narrator's obsessiveness and paranoia, but it also signals the larger curiosities of this narrative. What commonalities might be noticed in these carefully selected last words, right? Seemingly, at least to my mind, one might notice that these are carefully selected, these are carefully selected. But to my mind, all these figures were figures who knew they were dying. And which is obviously the thing that this story wants to grapple with. And they knew they were dying, and perhaps they even sort of like accepted death. But what if one cannot anticipate the how, the when, or the why of death? If there is a pattern, reason or prejudice, if there is a pattern, reason or prejudice, that can be unearthed, how similar to the question in the poem that we read earlier might one be remembered? What will be said or thought of or thought about like our tiny or small lives? Who's to say? If one can anticipate death, perhaps one feels as though they can exert greater control over the challenge of living or of being human. But isn't this so often the case? Olman's speaker, as he later discovers, doesn't have Lyme disease or malaria or leukemia or a brain embolism, anything else, but he does have a wife. In other words, he has a reason to fear dying, a reason to want to live. So let me be clear, poets masterfully obsess over death. This is sort of what we do. This is our calling. This is typical of participants in our field. I wonder, however, how such sustained attention and obsession with loss and with gloom might in turn prevent one from actually living, from being present, from appreciating, as the narrator muses before the story closes, beauty or here-ness, even if it's the last time. And finally, I'm going to close our talk this morning with one final poem before we release you to your cookies. This is a poem entitled "The Salt Mine" by Jennifer Groz, and we'll just get a read of that. And again, it's talking about horses in some ways. When my mind lingers too long in the dark, I think of the salt mine at Wilixa, built 800 years ago, 1,000 feet underground, and of the workers who toiled there months and years at a time by candlelight, who, after hours, carved chapels so they could pray, salt crystal chandeliers to light them, who carved statues of luminaries of their day, kings and queens, popes and artists, Copernicus, Beethoven, Goethe, and saints whose feet and hands are worn away now from centuries of kissing, a project faster than any single life could complete, a cathedral that commenced Roman, then Gothic, then Renaissance, and ended Baroque. I think how the human heart is an underground labyrinth filled with chambers, how history is murky, lopsided, and literally dissolving, how a tour guide instructs visitors to lick the walls. And most unbearable, I think of the horses lowered in by harness, that then bred below, who trod in circles to work the pulleys that raised and lowered baskets of supplies, the beautiful horses who, while workers chipped their stories onto every surface, wordlessly spent their whole lives underground. So this poem is 27 lines long and is constructed of a single run-on sentence. The poem thinks associatively. It's juxtaposing the speaker's mind when it lingers too long in the dark to the salt mine in Wilixa that follows. It is unclear why the speaker's mind lingers in the dark, but we gather a sense of this lingering, that this lingering may not be like an isolated incident. We feel like this is something the speaker knows. Groz's poem enacts the kind of duration that infuses her work with an emotional complexity and heft. It suggests something about deprivation, about history, about the sacredness of making and of being, the stories we record, and what encompasses a life, the work of a lifetime. Each clause her speaker adds, each detail the mind reaches for, the amount of time and space dedicated to exploring the after hours of those who inhabit this mind, reveals another facet of the speaker's own emotional or psychological state of being, several of the many chambers of the underground labyrinth of the heart. These workers shaped spiritual lives and communion. We see they carved chapels, they prayed, they carved objects to hold and reflect and disperse light, which is to say that they illuminated or they were illuminated. These workers sculpted, like they crafted statues of figures of admiration. They recognized and honored royalty and hierarchy. They honored artists. They learned math. They learned science and astronomy. They appreciated music. They established culture and constructed art and architecture, writing, criticism, plays, like each made their contribution to a history, as murky or as lopsided as it may be. Despite the fact that people in general can be complicated and various and unpredictable, Groz's poem enacts a certain fullness of a life and society, which, when juxtaposed against the poem's close, imbues the poem with resonance. And I want to leave us here that Groz closes her poem and lingers on these beautiful horses that were lowered into and spend their lives trotting in the circles to pull the work pulleys. Many of these horses, of course, were bred below. They've spent their lives wordless in the dark, and in knowing nothing but darkness, which Groz's speaker finds most unbearable. I don't know that I can say I understand, the entirety of what Groz's poem means to communicate, but it feels in part like it has something to do with the privilege or perhaps luck. Something about those horses reminds me of James Wright's widely recognizable poem, which is entitled Lying in a Hammock at William Duffy's farm in Pine Island, Minnesota, which he closes his poem with this phrase, quote, "I have wasted my life," end quote. Though what choice did these horses have what choice do they have for their lives when they're lowered and bred into, and who might give ear to their complaint? What I mean to say is that it is a privilege to be able to write. At least when I think about writing, I think of it as a privilege. To have the capacity and the opportunity to chip our stories onto every surface, to add our voices to the many voices that make up a history or a lineage, which is a project vaster than any single life could complete. The horses don't have that privilege. They live and are bred only for their labor. If their stories are to be shared, it will depend upon someone else who deems their stories, the contribution of their lives, important, valuable, worthy of our sustained attention. These are the questions that I pondered when I was thinking about writing the Previously Owned, the collection that you all have so graciously and generously read. Is it okay to be human? Whose stories are yet to be told? What am I paying attention to? And what does it reveal about me, about my questions, about the unresolvable facts of my own life? I probably have more questions than I have answers, to be sure, though craft helps. If thinking is what human beings do with experience, then duration, as a craft technique, allows me space to feel my way through my own lived and learned experiences, which I think it can do for all of us who are exploring writing as well. And it also gives me something to do ultimately with my hands. And so thank you very much for your time and attention. And I don't know if there are any quick questions before you all depart, but I'm happy to answer them. They can be about anything that we've talked about here. They can be about the book. They can be about the writing life in general. Yes?
Well, how do you inspire yourself to really write?
The inspiring of oneself to really write, I will say, part of the role of the work of writing is also about discipline as part of your practice. Like sometimes I go to my writing desk, and when I sit at my writing desk, it doesn't mean that I'm going to automatically like get a poem out of that session that I'm sitting there, but it does mean that like my idea of writing is that I'm living in language. So I might read like an interview from like another poet. I might do some reading at my writing desk. I might look at an old poem that I'm like trying to figure out and revise. And sometimes maybe some things begin to happen from that practice. But also don't diminish the value of like taking walks, like going outside, being able to like, some of my best ideas come from like when I'm taking a shower or when I'm like cooking in the kitchen. A lot of the ideas that I have, those moments of sort of like lightning striking you, don't often happen when I'm like at the desk itself, but it happens like as part of like of the living of one's life. So part of it is discipline. Like part of it, I think, is like if you dedicate yourself to showing up at the desk, I think many wonderful things can happen. But also just know that like that paying attention means that even when I'm not at the desk, like as long as I'm attending to myself and to the world, like we can make poems out of so many different things. So hopefully that answers your question. Wonderful. Yes.
Image and detail can be captured in few words, such as William Carlos Williams' Red Wheelbarrow.
Yes. Yeah. Image and detail. It's like they are they're so connected and so interwoven with one another. And I love, teaching my students about those things as well, because they often have a lot of those questions too. Other questions that those might have? Yes.
What's your favorite poem about death?
Favorite poem about death? I will say that changes quite frequently, because like as I think with all writers, our poems are constantly changing. Right now, though, I would say that among my favorite poems about death is a poem by W.H. Auden that is entitled Musée des Beaux-Arts. It was written in response. It's an ekphrastic poem, which means it's a poem about another work of art. And it's a response to the artist Peter Bruegel's The Fall of Icarus, or Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. Definitely look it up. It's a great poem. And if you would also recognize my own poem, Boy Pulling a Thorn from His Foot, is sort of like in conversation with that particular poem, especially. So great, yeah, very great question. Other questions we can answer. Oh, yes.
In your opinion, what is something that someone should have to write as a poem as a writer?
What is something that someone should have?
What is something important that is important as a writer, as a poem writer?
What is important for like to have as a writer? I think I would say probably the one of the most important things to really become a very strong writer, I think, is becoming a really strong reader. I often get really sad when I'm having workshops with my students, and I like the first day I'll ask them like, who are you reading? Who are you excited about? And if I have students who are like, I'm not reading anyone, that just gets so sad about that. So I think there's because reading teaches us to what we've been talking about, this whole idea of paying attention. Reading teaches us to pay attention, or it teaches us to pay closer attention. And so I think the better reader that you are, the stronger writer you become. And I think that it also helps you to then write from experience rather than about experience, because that enables your reader to like really engage with your work in a particular way. So I would say if anything that a writer needs to have, I would say like is a strong reading background for sure. Other questions? Back in the back here. The thorn, for me, what it symbolizes, I would say that it's definitely many things, but one of the leading and guiding questions of this book, especially when I was putting it together, and I think even of my last book as well, is the question of like, is that very question of like, what have you learned? Like, what have you learned from standing here and documenting your own pain, or documenting like Black pain? It's a question that I'm constantly asking about my own approach to poetics. We are in constant conversations around elements of like trauma as it's regarded, and trauma as it is being displayed, and the black body in pain for public consumption is like something that I'm like constantly thinking about. And while the work of art, I think, has the possibility of being resonant and being, deeply able to create these empathic links, I think that we run the risk also of being exploitative about our own sort of like lived experiences, and sometimes our pain being on display ends up being something that it's the way that we can sort of like gawk at items in a museum. So the thorn for me is really like the sticking point of this question of ethics and of the ways in which, thinking about how to write about my own life, I have to put into question my own sort of like moral ethics in terms of how one is the moral quandary of putting one's work on display, especially when one's work involves a life that has been filled with challenge or pain or difficulty, and finding ways to continue to like, if I'm going to write about all these other things, to find ways to like write about joy as well, and to write about perseverance, and to write about love and hope and belief, which is something I think is deeply important as well. So thank you for that question. Other questions before I know you'll all have to get cookies and things like that. Yes.
Just have one question, because now that you're a father,
Yes.
you have a 2-year-old, busy as a professor teaching your classes.
Yeah.
How do you find the time to work on your poetry? Do you have your regular schedule when you sit at your desk?
Yeah, I do have. I do generally have at least one day a week that I dedicate at least a few hours of my day to sitting at the desk. And luckily, my wife is also a poet and writer, and so we will take turns, sort of like, on baby duty while the other sort of like has their time at the desk. But I think it's as similar to what I was mentioned to the first question. Like dedicating oneself to a specific practice is so deeply important. And even if it means that all that you get out of that particular session is like 2 lines of a poem, like that's like what you really are doing is it's about training your own body and mind to like have certain expectation, the expectation of like going to the work and going to your desk, because then I think you can condition yourself to be able to make space for it. I'm grateful to be on a teaching teaching schedule as well, because it means that certain breaks do afford me the opportunity to be able to write like during our winter or our summer breaks. And I'm happy to say that as well, that I'm finally getting my first sabbatical at the end of this academic year, so that is also going to be great. Yeah, that'll be great definitely be great for writing. I'm working on a sort of like creative nonfiction project as well as new poems, and so I'm hoping to get a good amount of work. I'll be on sabbatical for a year, so I'm hoping to get a good amount of work done over that time as well. So yeah, I think having dedicating yourself to your practice and trying to be as rigid about it as you can. Things will happen, there will be times where you have to step away from it, but dedicating your life, dedicating your time to it, I think it is invaluable when you like set that time aside for yourself. It means that you're taking yourself seriously and you're taking your work seriously, and I think that that's really important. So thank you for that question, Beth. Wonderful. Well, I know it's 11:58, and I know you all probably have a next place to get to. Thank you so much for being here once again, and for reading the book, and for just spending time with me this morning.